On the 14th of October 2018, there was a canonization ceremony in Rome, which was of great excitement to those of us in Liverpool, because it was the canonization of Saint Oscar Romero. The picture shows that how many people were there? 70,000 people. Unfortunately, I wasn't there because I was in Palestine. I was very happy to be in Palestine, but what an occasion, and what an occasion to miss. But in November 2017, Anne and I were able to take part in a pilgrimage to San Salvador, led by the Romero Trust. For those of you who are not too sure on your geography, El Salvador is in Central America. That's the bit, strangely enough, between North America and South America. But it's roughly the area around the Bay of Mexico, edged by Cuba on the other side. It's a beautiful place, El Salvador. Fantastic. I didn't know quite what to expect, but the beauty. And the hills looking out towards Honduras, and the lake at Suchitoto. And Suchitoto is sort of tourist central in El Salvador. But Anne and I love plants, and there were house plants everywhere. But not just in the houses. In fact, hardly any in the houses. They were bursting out of the hedgerows and the sides of the streets and coming up between the cracks in the pavement. Amazing. The place we stayed was called Centro Loyola, so you'll guess it was a Jesuit foundation, and it was on a hillside overlooking the city of San Salvador. And you could see this beautiful view from the window in the chapel. A beautiful chapel. I loved the crucifix on the wall, partly because of the elegance with which it was made. One evening we had Mass with the auxiliary bishop of San Salvador, who had been a colleague of Oscar Romero's. Now, these days, he's Cardinal Gregorio Chavez. But he's the auxiliary bishop, which is pause for thought. On our very first day in San Salvador, we visited the Hospitalito. The Hospitalito is the place where Romero lived, and it means little hospital or hospice. And he lived in a 2-bedroom place, a tiny little bungalow. And as 1980 drew on, and he got more and more in trouble with the military, the sisters urged him to leave the little house and to move in and live in the sacristy behind the altar. You see the altar at the bottom behind the... But you see the altar, but you don't see the sacristy. The sacristy is behind the altar. So that's a picture taken in 2017. And this is the picture taken in 1980. It's the second or two after Oscar Romero was assassinated. It's a very peculiar story because it was the first anniversary of the death of a woman called Sarah Meadra de Pinto, and she was the mother of the editor of the Independence newspaper. And because it was her anniversary Mass, the editor and his team and their photographer had come along to this Mass in the evening. First crack of the bullet, the camera is out, the picture's taken, and these next 2 slides are taken on the actual moment of his assassination. Which means that as Oscar Romero was just finishing the homily, he must have seen his assassin enter the church, raise his rifle and shoot. So he saw his death coming. And proof of this is that the vestments that are now kept as relics of Romero are covered in sweat, cold sweat. Today, behind the altar, next to the crucifix, it says, "On this altar, Monsignor Oscar Arnulfo Romero offered his life to God for his people." On the wall outside the little house where he lived is a beautiful mural, decorated by the artist Ferdinand Lart. And I look at this style of art now and think it's Salvadorian art, but it's actually invented by this man, Fernando Lart. We're used to it on Romero crosses. As you look at the pictures, you think, that's very beautiful. And then you see, why has that man got a foot missing? Why has that person got no hands and no feet? Why? It's pictures, graphic representations of mutilation, as well as Oscar Romero in the centre. This slide shows Oscar in the middle with the Holy Spirit, and that sundial, that's a representation of God. There's an awful lot of art in El Salvador, and you begin to wonder which Romero, who's got the accurate representation of Romero? Because on this slide, he looks so benevolent and pastoral and kindly. He's the sort of father figure, Romero. One of the first things we did in San Salvador, was go to the Wall of Remembrance. You see how long this wall is? Black marble, carved full of names, and right near the beginning of it, you see between those two flowers, Oscar Arnulfo Romero. Because after Romero was assassinated, the violence went crazy. He was doing his best to keep a lid on it, to stop the violence. That was the reason he was assassinated. He said in his sermon on the Sunday before he was killed to the soldiers, I beg you, I order you, stop killing. The killing must stop. And in saying that, he signed his own death warrant. And he knew he had, because the morning of his assassination, he went to see his confessor. He made his confession. He chose as the reading for the Mass at which, this final Mass, the Gospel, unless a grain of wheat shall fall, which wasn't the reading for the day. At the end of this big, long list of the 70,000 people who disappeared during the war are two pictures moulded into the cement of the wall. It's a different style of art, but I find this portrayal of sadness deeply moving. Two women facing loss. And then next to them, there's a picture which echoes the feeling of unless a grain of wheat should die. Only this isn't wheat, this is maize. And you see the body with the roots of the maize growing round it and blood coming out into a chalice. Central America runs on maize. In the cathedral, in the crypt, is the shrine to Oscar Romero. And when he was moved from the central part of the cathedral into the crypt and the tomb was opened, they were disappointed to find that he had decomposed. He wasn't as he was when he died, which is what they were hoping for, of course, as a further sign of sanctity. But he'd given enough signs of those. After we'd visited the cathedral, we went to the Dominican church of El Rosario, which is beautiful, but it's in the brutalist style of architecture. For those of you who know it, Preston bus station is brutalist, but nobody would ever claim that that was beautiful. In El Rosario, the Stations of the Cross are made out of leftover building materials. They're quite extraordinary. The 15th station, the Station of the Resurrection, I found completely spellbinding. Those are leftover building rods, and they speak so powerfully. But when I'd finished looking at the stations, I went to sit in the Blessed Sacrament Chapel for a while, and I was horrified. Somebody had broken the tabernacle. But as I sat and looked, I realised it was broken from the inside. This is God getting out. You can't keep God in a box. And that image has lived with me ever since. And it was the image that was behind some of our response to the Eucharistic Congress when it was in Liverpool this year. You cannot keep God in church. The next site that we were taken to was UCA, the University of the Central Americas, and we went to Centro Monsignor Romero, which is the place where 6 Jesuit priests had their brains blown out. Not just the Jays, but their housekeeper and the housekeeper's daughter as well. The reason why the Jesuits were killed is because they were considered by the government to be the brains behind the resistance. So this was in 1989, 9 years after the death of Romero, and the civil war was at its full height, its full intensity, and these academics were slaughtered by the government. In front of the house where the killings took place is a little rose garden. The reason they were able to be identified as being murdered rather than killed in some internal squabble, as the government tried to claim, is that when the assassins put the bodies back into the rooms, they put them in the wrong rooms. The day we were there was the anniversary, the 30th anniversary of this assassination. And we went to an event at UCA where the 6 Jesuits, the housekeeper and her daughter, were commemorated on the altar cloth. And you see it says, "Who lives amongst us, still living amongst us." And the homily was given by the Cardinal Chavez. The event was preceded by a discussion about current politics. Difficult for me to follow because I can't speak Spanish, but fortunately there was a PowerPoint, and it became clear in the PowerPoint that they were talking about the Arena Party, which is the sort of equivalent of our right-wing party, the party of the ruling class, saying it was better before the revolution, better before the socialists got in. At least we knew who the enemy was, which has an awful ring of truth about it, because currently El Salvador is awash with gangs. It's a terrible place to be a young person, especially to be a young man. There's not much future for young men. And you see from this picture the sort of homes that people live in. The shanties at the side of the road. The next place we got taken to was the site of another assassination where the Maryknoll sisters were killed. Now, these are Americans, US citizens, and they'd been home to America and appeared on the television and had been critical of the government. The government didn't like this, surprise, surprise, and as they returned, they were met at the airport by 2 of their friends, one sister and one laywoman, and as they were driving away, a military jeep pulled in behind them, and a military jeep pulled in front of them, and they got taken off into the country where they were raped and then assassinated. This was a pilgrimage to many sites of death. The next place we got taken to was a place called Casa de Formacio El Despertar. El Despertar means the awakening, and it was the home and the church of a Father Otavio Ortiz, who was the very first priest to be killed. He died before Romero. But he was a young man who ran a pastoral centre for young people, and one day the military drove in through the metal gate, flattened the gate. The priest, Father Otavio, comes out to see what's going on and is shot. The young men who were in formation there tried to climb over the roof, and they were shot. That's a long time ago. That's before 1980. We met Anita, his sister. That's Anne and Anita. Anita says she was one of 5, and she's the only surviving child. At the back of this place, El Despertar, there was this wonderful picture of Central and Southern America in the shape of maize. And I said earlier that Latin America runs off maize, and there's pictorial proof. The slogan on the wall, "The voice of justice can never be killed." Optimism, determination in the face of great brutality. Next to that picture, that mural, is this one, picture of Romero. And the wording on there says, "We have to be microphones for God." It struck me after a while that Romero's like a lighthouse. He's like, this is the land of volcanoes, so maybe he's more like a volcano. But he's the light. And in the light from Romero, we see the others who are standing in his shadows. People like the assassinated Jesuits, and Father Ottavio Ortiz, and the 70,000 others who we can so easily forget. El Salvador is a place that is very, very obsessed with death, I think. And this next picture shows the Garden of Gethsemane and this cartoon character of the Dog of Death. And that's on the side of a bus. It's not in a church. This next one, well, I don't think it's an advert for dentistry, but it just shows how much mural, how much public art there is across El Salvador. The next one I loved. It's a stencil that we saw on the sides of lots of buildings, and it says, "In this house, there is no violence against women." In Romero's birthplace, Ciudad Barrios, well, I can say Ciudad with such confidence because it says Ciudad, and it means village, town, the town of Barrios, where Romero was born. His actual birthplace is now, as well as a shrine to Romero, the chapel, the room where he was born is now a chapel, but the rest of the building is a coffee cooperative, which I think is amazing, because this is industry and wealth and commerce and endeavour of the local people, and for that to be associated with Oscar Romero is just wonderful. When he was 14, his father wanted him to get a proper job. Oscar wanted to be a priest. He played at being a priest, but no, that wouldn't do. So father apprenticed him to a carpenter. And this slide saying, "No votes for Arena, they are thieves," is written on the wall of the shed where Oscar was apprenticed to be a carpenter. And when they've repainted the wall, they haven't painted over the slogan. He was very proud of the spirit level that he made while he was there. And every time he went back, even when he was the Archbishop, he always wanted to see his spirit level. I've mentioned a few times about different images of Romero, so whose Romero is this? Well, the handsome fellow next to him is Father Rutilio Grande. The sort of quizzical-looking one, that's Oscar Romero. In the church in Ciudad Barrios, where he said his first Mass, there's this enormous mural of his assassination. And it's a different style of art. It's not Fernando art, but it's so powerful. You see on this first section of the mural, the government pointing at him, the man with the submachine gun, and the faces of his people distraught. And then when you get to close in on Romero himself, that's feeling of movement in the picture with how many chalices are there? It's an extraordinary piece of work. And then, not religious at all. This is an organisation for lost children, abandoned children. You see the little sad shadow in the doorway. This is art at the service of civic society. The next piece of art is pretty grim, really. It's in a place called El Mazzotti. It's a place where 1,000 people were killed after they'd been persuaded to assemble there because it was safe. Everyone would be safe in El Mazzotti, so all the women and children from the area crowded into the little village. And then the military moved in, the crack troops, and 140 children were herded into the tiny little house that stood at the side of the church. All that's left of it now is you can see the paving that was the floor of the priest's house for when he visited. 140 children under the age of 12 were put into that and slaughtered, some of them thrown into the air and caught on bayonets. And if a soldier refused to do that, he was threatened with a bullet to the head. And when they'd all been killed, these children, a grenade was thrown in so that the building fell. In 1993, a group of Uruguayan forensic scientists came in to investigate it because there was a rumour that there'd been a massacre in El Mazotte. The government denied it, of course, no such thing, hearsay. What they didn't know was that on the day of the slaughter, one woman had escaped. She'd pretended to be dead and had crawled out across cactus under the cover of a herd of pigs escaping. That sounds like the Gadarene swine, doesn't it? But she escaped, and for 2 days she couldn't speak. She was completely incoherent with grief. But she was the reason that the story of the slaughter became known. And I say in 1993, this team came in, the government went with them, laughing at them, saying nothing happened here. They said, oh, look, there's a mound in the middle of the village. We'll start digging there. And for 2 days they dug and found nothing. On the third day, bit of an echo there, on the third day they started to find things. They found human remains. And then they found bullet cases. And from the bullet cases, they were able to identify where they'd been manufactured in the United States. And they were able to identify who they'd been issued to, crack troops in El Salvador. So they were able to prove beyond any doubt at all that the massacre had taken place and it had been done by the military. At the end of all that, we wanted something positive. And we were taken on the last day of our pilgrimage to the town, the little village of Guaymango. And this is the village that features in the CAFOD Connect to El Salvador. So if your parish were involved in Connect to El Salvador, this is the place you were supporting. And it is such a beacon of hope. It's poor. In the kitchen, it's not exactly mod cons, is it? There are 2 bricks with a fire underneath them and a pot, and then another 2 bricks and another fire and another pot. And they were cooking our lunch. It was beans. There were a lot of beans in El Salvador. This is the water supply. They were considered themselves fortunate because they had a tap, and the tap dripped into this large cistern, and the bowls round the outside were used for taking water out. You never put your hand in the water or soap in the water. This was the clean water. You took the water out, and to the side of it you can just see there's a slop stone. You poured water over yourself and used some of the soap that they made for themselves. Next to the cistern there was a large open space, just flattened clay. It was dried mud, but at the edge of it there was this looks like a pizza oven. Great, but perhaps the most significant thing in the whole little complex, it's a building with about 4 rooms in it, are these silos. Now, why am I saying that silos are so important? It's because they provide storage for their crops, so the maize seeds can go in there. They even grow rice, these people. They're so ingenious. And things in the metal containers, in the silos, are safe from rodents. So it's these 3 very undistinguished looking tin cans that allow them to live day by day. Oh, here are some other residents sitting next to the pizza oven. Chickens. It's a CAFOD Connect 2 project that they were given eggs. From the eggs, they hatch them into chicks, and you can see in this chicken run here how many chickens they have, and they pass them on to people. So it's a sort of pyramid giving rather than a pyramid selling scheme. From their industry and their care of the chickens, they're able to spread chicken keeping across the neighbourhood amongst their cooperative. And the fellow in the middle here at this table, at the end of the table, that's Carlos Ramos, who is an agricultural specialist. He's been through education and he's come back as a specialist. And much to our amazement, there's a Welsh flag and a cross of St. George on the wall. They've had visitors from the UK before, and they're delighted that we're interested in them. The latest scheme they've got are pigs. Here they are, and it's the same sort of pyramid scheme. The pigs produce piglets, the piglets get passed on, and that's food. Here's the family, two of the young members of the family with mum. These are two boys, and the problem for young boys is what happens to them next. There's compulsory and free education up to age 12, but after that you have to pay. So you need money to have an education. And then after that, if you want to go to university, you need more money or a scholarship. To get a scholarship, you have to do well in public exams. If you don't get to university, what then? Well, they decided that they would open a shop to help the young men have something to do, because they're very industrious. They never sit around twiddling their thumbs. They're always doing. So they opened a shop, and then the gangs arrived, asking for protection money. They refused, so the gangs came back with threats. They refused again and left the building, moved somewhere else, and opened up again. This time when the gang came back, they came back with submachine guns, and they flattened the building. They fired at the building until it collapsed. So it's very hard to be a young man in El Salvador. It's pretty hard to be a young person, but the men have it worst. In the city, the gangs have their areas. So the young people are more or less under curfew. You can't leave your own area after dark, which makes education excessively important, extremely important, because it offers a way out. If you don't get out, if you're lucky, you're in a village like Guamango, where the cooperative has a mixed economy and shares the learning that they get, because the people like Carlos, they meet with their peers from across Central America and share techniques and learnings. So this is a lovely place. You see growing palms, bananas, coffee, maize, chilies. It's peaceful and productive. And on the floor, drying there in the sunlight, coffee beans. And here's Carlos, close up. He says that two of his brothers are priests. And he says very proudly, they're Romerista. So these days I call myself a Romerista, because not all people in El Salvador are Romeristas. Some of them still call him that communist. He got what was coming to him. Hard to believe, but true. In Guamango, I saw the only evidence of enculturation of religion in the whole of our visit. And this was in the little chapel. And you see at the bottom of the crucifix, it says, Renovación Charismático. It's charismatic renewal. And then this final picture, a wonderful Sister Martha Zeichmeister. Sister Martha is an Austrian. She says she's not a professor, though I'm sure she is. She lectures in systematic theology at UCA. And she said, she's been here 12 years. She said a few years ago, a brother rang her up to say, Sister, can you tell me a definition of the kingdom of God? And she said, you know what time it is? Her brother said, no, why? Why, she says, it's 4:00 in the morning. Yes, but I desperately need to know what is the kingdom of God. She says, why do you want to know this? He replied, the parish priest says if I can give him a good answer, he'll give us a football field. Sister Martha said, I'll tell you what the kingdom of God is. The bastards will not win. Which for me is the best definition of the kingdom that I have ever heard. Thanks for listening.